Good morning and happy Friday. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes at the top of the hour. Give folks a few more minutes to log in, get settled, a cup of coffee or tea. But thank you for joining us. Good morning, everyone. It is 9 a.m. Friday. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to get started in just another minute or two. We'll give folks an opportunity to log in. Hopefully you all received a copy of our recently published white paper on today's topic. It was emailed out to folks yesterday morning. If you did not receive a copy of the white paper, it is posted on our website, and we'll make sure that we share another copy of it after this webinar with the PowerPoint slides from today. So if you are eager to dig into the materials and the information that we're going to be sharing. It is all documented in our white paper, and we encourage you to take a look at it. We're looking for really constructive feedback on all of the recommendations that we're proposing here today. And we'll just get started another minute. I see a bunch more people joining us, which is awesome. All righty, let's get started. Today's webinar, we're focused on some proposed changes that we are anticipating making to our cost assessment model's physical consolidation analysis. If you are unfamiliar with the cost model, we're going to go over that in just a little bit. But fair warning, this is a fairly wonky technical webinar workshop. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box. We'll do our best to dig in and hopefully clarify things. But before we dig in, let's talk about the meeting logistics. Let's get this one. So ways to participate. We have some folks who may be joining us through our Cali PA live webcast. That's on our website. And folks who are participating that way, if you're interested in submitting a question or a comment or feedback, you can email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov. We do have folks on our team who are monitoring that inbox and can share those questions or comments with us while we're presenting today, and we can share those on your behalf. For those who are joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A box to submit questions or comments to us. You should be able to see what other folks have submitted, and you can upvote. I think there should be like a little thumbs up button if you like someone else's question. By upvoting, it makes sure that goes to the top of the queue so we can address your question or comment. We do have a smaller group with us today, so I think it's possible for us to really have more of a dialogue, which would be awesome. So you can raise your hand in Zoom during different parts of the webinar. We can call on you. You can share a comment, a question, feedback using your own voice, which is always appreciated and valued. Please become familiar with the little menu options in Zoom. And if you have any questions, again, please use that Q&A box. Okay. So today's agenda, we're covering quite a bit of material. We're going to provide a brief overview of what the cost assessment is and the big changes that we're hoping to implement for next year. An overview of what the physical consolidation component is in the model, some of our proposed updates on how that works, and very important, some of the unit cost updates that we're looking to adopt for the model and then next steps. So my name is Kristen Appold. I am the senior for our needs analysis unit within the Division of Drinking Water. I'm going to be providing the cost assessment background information for you today, and then I'm going to turn things over to Moj on our team, who's going to really dig in on the physical consolidation analysis and the changes that we're looking to implement. But before we get started, we always like to kind of start our webinars with a quick poll question to get a sense of, oops, let me restart the poll, relaunch poll. See, there we go. We like to get a sense of who's with us today, how familiar are you with the topic that we're discussing. So we're going to be covering a component of our cost assessment model, which is embedded in our broader needs assessment work that we do every year. All right, I'm going to shut down the poll and share the results. Looks like the majority of folks, but it's kind of split fairly evenly, but the majority of folks are not familiar with the cost assessment model within the broader needs assessment. So that's good to know. I'll try to provide a bit more background then when we cover that in the next few slides. And next poll question, we did share a version of the white paper yesterday morning, which we are going to assume that you have not had an opportunity to read yet, but wanted to see if anyone has had an opportunity to at least skim it. Okay, and the poll, share the results. Very impressed. We do have a number of folks who've actually read the whole thing and have skimmed through it, which is great. And then a number of people who plan on reading it. And this might be a first for us. We have nobody who's indicated that they have no intention of reading it. So that's good news. So thank you. A lot of effort goes into writing those white papers and trying to document everything that we're discussing. So if you did not receive a copy of this, maybe you registered last minute for the event, we did finally get it posted on our website. We'll make sure that this hyperlink or a copy of that white paper is shared out to all of the attendees after today's webinar. So you should see a copy of that report. All right. Well, since we do have about more than half of our folks today who are new to perhaps the needs assessment and the cost model, I'm going to try to provide a bit more background so you can understand why we're talking about this topic today. So the state passed legislation a number of years ago that helped create a new funding source at the State Water Board to fund a safer program here. And what that program is meant to do is really help address communities across the state who don't have access to safe, affordable drinking water. And the funding source that helps implement that program's goals is called the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. And the legislation that passed includes language that says that the funding that we have needs to be prioritized based off of the results in something called a needs assessment. And the needs assessment is something that my unit is responsible for. Comes out every year. We identify failing public water systems, which are community systems in K through 12 schools. We also identify at risk of failing water systems, as well as state smalls and domestic wells. And those are regulated by counties, state smalls and domestic wells, but we are required to develop a method for identifying those that are at risk. Once we have our list of failing and at-risk systems in communities, we then do something called a cost assessment, which is what we're focused on today. Essentially, the purpose of the cost assessment is to develop a big statewide price tag so that we can estimate what it might cost to implement long-term and interim solutions for our failing and at-risk systems. And then last but not least, we do an affordability assessment, trying to identify the communities that may struggle to afford to come back into compliance or to get off of our failing or at-risk list. But today we're really focused on our cost assessment work and the underlying assumptions within that model. So just to reiterate why we do the cost assessment and what we're supposed to be doing, Senate Bill 200 directs the Water Board to estimate our anticipated funding needs related to implementing our interim emergency measures and long-term solutions. It is supposed to inform how we prioritize our safer funding. It's really supposed to give us a sense of how much funding is needed compared to how much we have available so that we can make, hopefully, smart decisions around how that money is spent, and to communicate to others the extent of the challenges that we're facing across the state. I want to emphasize, and you'll hear us repeat this over and over and over again, the cost assessment model, the analysis that's done, the cost numbers that come out of it, none of that analysis and data is intended to inform local decisions. This is not an options analysis. This is not used in any way when we work with communities to try to inform any local decision making. Because this is a model, what we're doing is a big cost estimate and a big model. We are using available data, but it's very limited. And so therefore we have a lot of embedded assumptions, estimates in the model, which we know you should not base local decisions off of. So just want to keep emphasizing that we do not use it at the local level for any sort of decision making or work that we do with water systems. Okay, so who's included in the cost assessment? I covered this a little bit earlier, but it's worth highlighting. Again, so we are looking at trying to identify modeled interim and long-term solutions for failing water systems. You'll see here we assess failing water systems for a number of different criteria. We've highlighted, you can see the green text there. When we first did our model in 2021, the very first iteration of it, the criteria for failing was smaller than what it is today. So there's a lot of discrepancies between kind of our inventory of systems that we used back in 2021 when we first did our model versus where we're headed in the future. So our new failing list of public water systems include failing systems for E. coli violations, treatment technique violations, and repeated monitoring reporting violations. These are things that we need to accommodate in the newly designed model. Our at-risk public water systems are included in our analysis, and we identify at-risk systems in our risk assessment, looking at water quality risk, accessibility risk, affordability, and technical managerial financial capacity risk. If you're interested in learning more about how we identify our at-risk public water systems, please go to our webpage. We have lots of documentation, webinars, PowerPoints on how we got there. It's a process that evolves over time as data becomes available. We then identify at-risk state small water systems and domestic wells. Again, there's been quite a bit of change in how we identify our at-risk state smalls and domestic wells from the first iteration of our cost assessment model, which was done back in 2021. At that time, our at-risk systems were only looking at water quality risk, and that was it. And actually what I've noticed here is we're missing our whole new category. We've added in the past 2 years, both drought risk and socioeconomic risk. And so our at-risk state smalls and domestic wells, that inventory, those systems that we're looking at, has changed quite a bit from what we had in 2021 to where we are now. Because we've added additional risk categories like drought and socioeconomic risk to help us really identify that more narrow list of communities that may be at risk, we've got a smaller subset of systems within this category. You'll see that throughout the slides as we look at a comparison between the 2021 model and what we're recommending here. So let's talk about the proposed changes to the entire model. We have been hosting lots of workshops on this. So if you're not, again, not as familiar with this work and you want to understand the history and how things have evolved over time, please take a look at our webpage. Again, lots of documentation there with white papers, webinars, PowerPoints on how the cost model has evolved. And if you're not familiar with the webpage, we're providing the hyperlinks. So let's talk about how the old model used to function, because we are proposing to streamline it to make it a little bit simpler and easier to follow and to operate. So the 2021 cost model, which again was developed back in 2019 and 2020 with our colleagues over at UCLA and Corona Environmental and a bunch of other subcontractors. The first step of the old model was to look at many types of long-term solutions all at the same time. So we would model everything out, different options in the first step. And then we would conduct a sustainability and resiliency assessment that was looking at a few kind of resiliency metrics and cost numbers. to compare the top 2 modeled solutions. And then we would select the best solution, taking into consideration that scoring and the cost estimate number. Unfortunately, with this model, it was a good first step. However, we saw in the results that it tended to over-select point of entry, point of use devices over treatment for failing systems, especially where we think the agency would not really want to do that in the long run. So we wanted to kind of rejigger the model to make sure that the results better aligned with the priorities of the SAFER program and at the State Water Board, and with reality and where we were seeing our SAFER projects and funding being allocated over the last few years. So we wanted to rethink the model, and this was our proposed new process that we put out last year in a public workshop for feedback. And this is the newer process with a slight change. So step 1 is to actually look at physical consolidation as the first step in the model. This aligns a lot more closely with the program priorities and the State Water Board priorities around failing and at-risk water systems. If physical consolidation is not a viable solution within the model, we'll then look at whether or not treatment may be viable for our systems that are failing for water quality issues. If treatment may not be an option, or if the size of that system indicates centralized treatment may not be a solution, the model will then look at point of use, point of entry. But in those, there are going to be some cases where that may not be viable. And in that case, we're going to circle back and try to identify small scale treatment with O&M assistance for those really small systems. Now, we used to have in here from last year, potentially bottled water, hauled water, but we really don't see that as a viable long-term solution. So that's been modified here. And again, we're going to be going over the last 3 steps in future webinars. Today, we're really focused on how the model looks at physical consolidation. But wanted to get your quick feedback on what were the changes that we are recommending for the big picture models process. Let us know what you think. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. It looks like we've got 48% think that the recommended changes sound good. A few more folks, 39%, would like to learn more. We have one person who thinks this is headed in the wrong direction, and a few folks who are neutral on the topic. Thank you for your feedback. Again, if you want to really dig in on this, please feel free to chime in during some of our discussion breaks, and then always you can email us your comments or questions on the side. With that, I'm going to move things over to Moj. Moj on our team has really helped spearhead the physical consolidation effort here, working with Will Allen on our team, who was responsible for the GIS analysis. Moj, you want to introduce yourself and then take over?
Yes, thank you, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Moj Kamas. I'm a water resource control engineer. I work in the needs analysis unit in the Division of Drinking Water. Hopefully today I will be walking you through the updated physical consolidation process and talking about the streamlined methodology, assumptions, and then hopefully get your feedback and review on any of the proposed assumptions that we will share with you. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we dive into details, I would like to show you a big picture overview of how physical consolidation works in the model. So physical consolidation is actually broken down to steps. So in step number 1, we try to identify our potential list of joining and receiving systems. And if any of the systems, they don't meet the criteria that we are recommending, then physical consolidation is not considered viable. And then we would look for alternative long-term solutions. For the systems that would meet the criteria, then we would take them to the GIS analysis. And there we apply distance criteria. And then again, we would assess for any systems that they don't meet the distance criteria, then physical consolidation is not considered viable again. And we would seek alternative long-term solutions. For the systems that would meet the distance criteria. So basically we export our GIS analysis spreadsheet, and then we start applying all cost assumptions, equations, multipliers to come up with the capital cost for each consolidation project. From there, we take each physical consolidation capital cost, and then we evaluate the funding viability threshold by comparing it against our recommended model funding viabilities. So if the project cost for the consolidation exceeds the viability, then again, physical consolidation is not considered viable, and we would seek alternative long-term solutions. But for the projects that meet the funding viability thresholds, then we would go to step number 5. So what happens in step number 5 actually is for any system that would meet, again, the criteria, the distance criteria, and the funding viability threshold, we would cost out additional infrastructure needs. So for example, if our receiving system is failing, let's say for water quality, then we would cost out additional treatment for them. If the receiving system has a sole source of water supply, then we would be looking for costing out a new source. We would be, for example, adding other essential infrastructure costs, increase the system sustainability. So all of that happens in step number 5. So before I dive into the details of each step, I would like to emphasize that through our internal work group that consists of our division of drinking water and then our division of financial assistance, we tried different physical consolidation options. And those options, we use different system size criteria and funding viability thresholds for both joining and receiving systems. And any number that you see on the coming slides is based on our recommendations. But if you have any question about how we developed or how we came to the conclusion of our recommendation, I really encourage you to visit our appendix. Everything is detailed in there, and we tried to calculate the cost for each option and make a comparison with the old criteria to come up to our recommendation. So now hopefully I'll walk you through the details of each step based on our recommended criteria. So next slide, please. Okay, so the first and foremost, we would like to identify who's receiving and who's joining systems. But before we do that, I would like to briefly define what's a receiving and what's a joining. So basically, a receiving system, if you want to think about it, it's our large community water system that subsume and expand to provide water supply, not only to their customers, but to the joining customers as well. So joining systems, though, are usually smaller public water systems, state wells, domestic wells, that dissolve within the boundaries of the receiving system. So they no longer exist, and they start receiving water from the receiving systems. Next slide, please. Okay. So now we defined who's joining and who's receiving. I would like to walk you through our criteria for the selection. So the slide that you see here represents a comparison between the old criteria and the recommended criteria. So if you look at my left-hand side, you see the old criteria were a bit restrictive in selecting the potential receiving system. So the old criteria excluded completely any failing or at-risk public water system from being a potential receiving system, and only looked at non-failing or non-at-risk with a population greater than 3,300 as a potential receiving system. Where on my right-hand side, our recommended criteria proposes to look at larger failing system with service connection greater than 1,000, and also larger at-risk and non-failing or at-risk with service connection greater than 500 to be as potential receiving system. So if you look at the total counts here, those numbers were developed actually based on the failing list from January 1st, 2023, utilizing the 2023 risk assessment results. So based on our recommended criteria, we have more potential receiving systems. So 801 system following our recommended updates compared to 578 systems following the old criteria.
And Moj, I just want to emphasize again, when folks are looking at the tables here and what's in the report, the old criteria and the estimated numbers are based off of the same inventory as the recommended updates on the right. So you can do more of an apples to apples comparison of how the criteria impacts the results.
Correct. Thanks for the addition, Kristen. And state smalls and domestic wells were excluded completely from being receiving systems. So I just want to emphasize that as well. So doing the same, but this time for identifying potential joining systems, the old criteria put the failing and at risk in population buckets while we are trying to they were trying to identify the joining system. So any failing or at risk less than 3,300 were considered potential joining. Our recommended criteria is based on service connection, but eventually the counts are very close. So we have 345 failing system compared to 346, very minimal difference. At risk public water system, our recommended criteria brings us to 444 systems compared to 463. We're excluding non-failing or at-risk, non-at-risk from being potential joining systems. And if you see here, the counts for state smalls and domestic wells following our recommended criteria is smaller. And this is because the inventory has changed. So the old criteria looks at state smalls and domestic wells that are at risk of water quality only, while our recommended criteria looks at the combined at risk. So this is not only the wells and the state smalls that are at risk of water quality, but the ones that are at risk of water quality, drought, and socioeconomic risk. So basically, we are utilizing the recent at-risk methodology, and we're looking at a smaller subset of systems. So the really at-risk state smalls and domestic wells this time. So this will bring our totals lower than the old criteria, because again, we're looking at a smaller inventory of state smalls and domestic wells. So 82,630 potential joining system compared to 101,322 following our old criteria.
Moj, before we move on, we have a few questions in the Q&A box that are related to step one. I think it's worth pausing and just addressing those now.
Of course.
So we have a question from Susan asking if the list of potential receiving and joining systems is publicly available. And Susan, the answer to that is no. We've just been publishing as part of this white paper estimated numbers based off of the failing list of January 1 and at-risk list. We aren't going to be publishing that list of systems since this is still an exploratory draft step in our redevelopment process, but something we may consider doing as part of the final cost assessment model results when we publish those next year. So hopefully that answers your question, Susan. If not, feel free to raise your hand or provide another question in the Q&A. And then we've got a few questions from Jennifer. Jennifer is asking, when identifying potential receiving and joining systems, are those identified based on risk criteria, or is the risk a priority criteria? And Jennifer, hopefully you can see on the screen here that yes, we do include at-risk water systems in both as criteria for receiving and joining systems. So hopefully that answers your question. And then there is a question on the cost component side from Jennifer, but I'm going to hold off until we get there in the slides. And then Jennifer also asks whether or not receiving systems are only identified when there's a neighboring joining system that is failing. I think we're going to get to that a little bit later, Jennifer, in the next step, which is the GIS component. But what Moj is going over now is how we come up with the full inventory of systems we include in the analysis. So we haven't put in distance criteria yet. This is purely who could potentially be a receiving system and who could potentially be a joining system. The selection process happens later. So if I didn't interpret your question correctly, Jennifer, feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you or provide another question in the Q&A box. Those were the questions. There was another question from Kyle earlier around why we don't include distribution system failure in our analysis. I think Kyle is referring to how we identify failing water systems. Kyle, our failing water system criteria is developed with our board input. And at this time, distribution failure is not necessarily part of that criteria unless it led to water quality violations. I'm not sure if Karen or Andrew wanted to weigh in on that. Okay, cool. All right, does anyone else have any questions around step 1 on how we identify our potential inventories of receiving and joining systems? All right, Moj, I don't see any hands, so let's keep going.
Okay, so after step number 1, and where we identified our potential receiving and joining systems, we take those 2 lists to the GIS analysis and we start applying our distance criteria. So from there, we would first and foremost identify the low-hanging fruit, and this is basically our intersect systems. So if you look at the small graphic here, the green polygon represents the receiving system boundary, and the 2 dots are an example of how a domestic well might intersect, for example, the boundary of a receiving system. So in that intersect analysis, we would look at any joining system that's a public water system or any domestic well or state small that is located within the boundaries of a potential receiving system. So we identify these ones and we exclude them from the route analysis. So the route analysis is a bit different. So for public water systems or state small water systems, we look at the maximum distance from the service area boundary from the joining system to the receiving system. And for domestic wells, we don't only look at the maximum distance, but we also look at any domestic well that intersects the route, and that route is between a potential public water system physical consolidation. So we call them route intersect. I will go through details on the distance criteria and also the counts of the systems that would meet the distance criteria in the following slides. So the distance criteria, putting it in comparison with the old model, we still maintain the same maximum route distance for public water systems unchanged. So we're still recommending 3 miles at a maximum distance. For state smalls, we are recommending to lower the maximum route from 0.38 miles to 1/4 mile, so 0.25 miles. For domestic wells, the old model looked at the route intersects. And again, those are the wells, the domestic wells that would intersect the route between a physical consolidation. Our model recommends looking at the route intersect and to look at any domestic well that's within a 0.25 mile distance from a receiving system boundary. If you have any question or you need any information on how we developed those analyses or the setup of the GIS, I would really encourage you to visit our Appendix A. There is like a breakdown of the GIS components and step-by-step process. Next slide, please. Okay. So after we applied the distance criteria that I was showing on the previous slides on our potential receiving and joining system, the table that you see here represents the counts of receiving systems that meet the distance criteria. So the 3 miles and the 0.25 for state smalls and domestic wells. So we see here that we have around 378 potential receiving systems that are meeting the distance criteria. And we definitely have more receiving systems compared to the old criteria. And again, we are utilizing the failing list from January 1st, 2023, and relying on the same inventory for the risk assessment results. Next slide, please. Okay. So for joining systems, our recommended criteria includes more failing and at-risk public water systems. So we have 173 potential joining system compared to 138. And we have 250 at-risk public water system compared to 193. So roughly 100 systems more following our recommended updated criteria. State small and domestic well counts again are low, and this is, I keep emphasizing this because we are utilizing different inventory. The old criteria relies on wells and state smalls that are at risk of water quality, while our state smalls and domestic wells that we utilize for the recommended updates are based on the combined criteria. So this will bring our counts lower. So in total, we're looking at 26,175 potential joining system compared to 35,619 potential joining system following the old criteria. So now we identified the receiving and the joining system that meet the distance criteria. We would export these ones to Excel, and we start conducting all the cost assumptions and all the cost equations in there. So the State Water Board actually conducted a rigorous research. We did a lot of back and forth, and we tried to collect the most up-to-date, prices by contacting consultants, vendors, engineering firms, also auditing and reviewing State Water Board funded projects, outreaching to small and medium-sized water systems. If you have any information or you want to see how we came up to the conclusion of each cost estimate, I would really encourage you to visit our Appendix B in the white paper.
Thanks, Moj. I just want to respond to a question that's coming from the inbox. There's someone who says they don't quite understand what we mean by state smalls and domestic wells as potential joining systems. These are systems that, these are communities served by state smalls and domestic wells that are designated as at risk right now in our risk assessment, and they are potentially joining in that they're at risk. So we would want to see if we could join them with another community water system. So for example, if a domestic well was joined to a potential community water system, it would mean that they're no longer relying on their domestic well for water. They would have a pipe connecting them to a community water system, centralized treatment, and they'd be getting their water that way. This is all hypothetical since it's a model. But that's what we mean by those domestic wells and state smalls that would be joining systems. So if that didn't quite answer your question, please feel free to raise your hand or provide another question. Oops. And then what is the maximum population served by a state small? I don't have the population number off the top of my head, but I know that it's 15 service connections or less, so very small. And again, state small water systems are not regulated by the State Water Board. They are regulated by counties. Okay. And then I see Eric has his hand raised. Eric, I'm gonna allow you to talk. There you go.
Hi, this is John Erickson with Community Water Center. You able to hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, thanks. I just had a couple questions about step 1 and step 2, I guess, for domestic wells and state smalls.
Sure.
One is, I guess, just seeing that the number of potential joining systems and the number of systems included is just decreased a lot, domestic wells and state smalls. And it seems like a lot of that's due to the reliance on this combined risk criteria. And I think from our understanding of the needs assessment, that combined risk criteria is set up so that even if you're at high risk for water quality, you might not have combined risk. So you could have really bad water quality, but you still wouldn't, I guess, be included in the cost assessment, or I mean, you wouldn't know it was really bad, but you'd be at high risk. I'm just wondering, I guess we can look at the details in the white paper, but what the thought process was that went into really relying more on the combined risk than looking at either water quality or drought risk separately.
So it's a good point. And for us, it aligns more with the direction and the public feedback that we had received on how we conduct the risk assessment for state smalls and domestic wells. There was feedback from both our advisory group and the public that we try to identify our at-risk state smalls and domestic wells using a similar method, or at least data points categories like we do for public water systems. So that's why we had added drought risk and socioeconomic risk. Now, that obviously gives us a bit of a smaller at-risk pool, but they are, in our mind, at least the top high priority at-risk communities. And because water quality risk, we don't have an essential failing list, if you will, that's equivalent for state smalls and domestic wells, since we don't have good data sets for that. So we want to make sure that we're being, I think, a little conservative around how we look at incorporating at-risk state smalls and domestic wells into the model. The numbers aren't too far off, except for, on state smalls for sure. But again, that kind of aligns with how we'd moved in evolving our at-risk methodology for state smalls and domestic wells. So hopefully that makes sense, Eric. Although if you guys disagree, feel free to let us know.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kristen. I had one other quick question, if I could, on step 2.
Yeah.
Just to understand, I guess, how the recommended updated criteria for distance works for domestic wells.
Yeah.
It sounds like the route intersects. So if it's along a modeled route, then it would be picked up. And then the 1/4 mile for the maximum route distance, is that regardless of whether there's going to be a consolidation between two public water systems, but just
Correct.
Any at-risk domestic well within a 1/4 mile of a potential receiving system then would be included based on that 1/4 mile distance?
Yes, and that is new to the model. That was not included in the first one.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and we lowered the distance criteria just a little bit from what it was in the first model, and that was based on observations of consolidations and pickups that we had seen through existing consolidation efforts. So we thought it was best to lower it a little bit to align with the reality that we're seeing.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep. All right, and then one last question from Susan. What problem gap with the old model is the new model focused on addressing or solving? So Susan, the old model we thought had pretty strict criteria around physical consolidation. It was a little, in reality, for example, here, let's go back to potential receiving and joining systems. So the old model was saying that failing systems and at-risk systems could not be receiving systems. But in reality, with our physical consolidation projects that the State Water Board is actually funding, we are funding projects where an at-risk water system or failing water system can be a receiving system, and we fund not only the consolidation of nearby systems, but treatment and long-term infrastructure to bring that system back into compliance. So we felt like this criteria was too restrictive. It didn't match reality. And so we wanted to expand it to make sure that it aligned with kind of the direction that the water board had taken. And so for us, it was really around making sure that the model reflected current projects and funding practices that we're starting to see around physical consolidation. And then we definitely wanted to make sure that the cost numbers, which we're about to go into, were updated to reflect, the cost increases that we've been seeing across the state, inflation, et cetera, et cetera. So it's about developing hopefully a more robust, more accurate cost estimate at the end so we can make better and better decisions around our funding. So hopefully that helps, Susan, answer some of your questions. All right, I don't see any other hands up or questions. let's get into step 3. Moj?
Yes. So after we did a lot of internal and external outreach to collect updated cost components for physical consolidation, in this slide and the other coming slide, I will be kind of summarizing for you the updated cost components. So in general, most of the cost components went up and are more inclusive in our recommended updates. So for example, pipeline costs went up to 220 from 155. Connection fees in the old model was based on averaging service connection fees for systems with service connection greater than 3,000, and it was like a lump sum of 6,200. In our recommended model, we are averaging connection fees for each receiving system. So for example, one time we're averaging the connection fees for a receiving system that would subsume joining public water systems, and one time for the receiving system that would subsume state small water system and domestic wells. So we have different connection fees for each one of the options that you see here on the table. And all of the data were based on utilizing recent EAR connection fees. Service line cost in the old model was a lump sum value of 5,000, applied only to intersect joining systems. So route systems were excluded from the analysis. Our recommended criteria proposes to include the service line cost for each joining system service connection applied to both intersect and route joining systems with a cost of 6,200. Admin cost in the old model was excluded for state smalls, domestic wells, and any system with service connection less than 15. Our recommended model proposes to include admin costs for all systems except domestic wells. This time it won't be a lump sum value, but it will be 15% out of the total construction cost. Next slide, please. Okay. So SQL cost, similar to the admin cost in the old model, it was excluded for any system less than 15 connections, state smalls, or domestic wells, and it was a lump sum value of 85,000. Based on our outreach, we recommend adding the SQL costs to all failing and at-risk public water systems, only excluding domestic wells. The SQL costs in our updated cost assumptions kind of differentiates whether it's an intersect or a route system. So for intersect systems, SQL will be applied as a lump sum of 25,000. For route systems, it's a lump sum of 100,000. It's kind of based on if the two systems are adjacent, we have like less disruption to the environment and probably less mitigation measures that needs to be applied. So subsequently less SQL associated costs. And this is how we came to that conclusion. And again, everything is documented in the appendix of the white paper. I really encourage you to go here and read all the detailed information if you have any questions. For contingency, we're keeping it 20% unchanged, but we are excluding the 20% contingency from domestic wells. Our proposed updated model recommends adding a 3% inflation that was not included in the old model, and also recommends adding 10% planning and construction that also was not included in the previous model. Next slide, please. Okay. Also, we are proposing to add a regional multiplier. It was not included in the physical consolidation in the old model. So what that regional multiplier does is it adjusts the pipeline and the service line costs depending on the receiving system county. So for example, if we have like a rural county, then we don't have to worry about it. But for urban counties, we will increase the cost by 32%. And for suburban counties, we'll be increasing the cost by 30%.
Before we move forward, just wanted to see if anybody had any immediate reactions to the cost components, and I'll wait to see if anyone wants to raise their hand or provide a question to the inbox. while folks are doing that, wanted to circle back to Jennifer's question from earlier. She asked whether or not CPUC fees are included in the analysis. And Jennifer, at this time, no, they're not, but something we could potentially look into if a receiving system is a CPUC regulated system, but we'd have to kind of think about that a little bit more. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that, Jennifer? And then Elisa is asking if domestic wells have to pay for their individual connections. Elisa, the purpose of the model is just to kind of create big statewide cost estimates, and we're trying to estimate what the connection fees total might be. Who ultimately pays for these things is really, that's based on reality when a consolidation project is actually happening, and there's negotiations between the receiving system and the state water board. So I can't speak to whether or not, who's paying for connection fees at this time. Because in the model, we're not delineating who pays. And then I see a hand raised. I'm gonna allow you to talk. The phone number. Should be able to click star or something. I can't remember the number. There you go.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. My name is Paola de la Cruz Perez, and I'm with Eastern Communities for Environmental Justice on the ancestral homelands of the tongues of people. Thank you all so much for this information. I'm wondering if y'all can explain where community engagement is being budgeted in this analysis, because you all know that it is as equally as important as any of these other elements that are being considered. Thank you.
Thanks for your feedback, and for folks who perhaps weren't able to hear because it was a little faint. The question was whether or not the cost model includes estimates for community engagement for these projects. I think we would consider that part of some of the admin and other kind of additional costs that we add onto this, but something we can definitely look into and try to figure out where to call out where it may be in the model. That's a good point. Community engagement is definitely important when moving forward with the consolidation project. Does anyone else have any questions or comments around that? Okay. Moj? Oops, Moj, we just got another one before we move on. There's a question around how we came up with the regional multiplier percentages. I know, Moj, that was used previously in the old model. Do you recall?
Right, so it was utilized in the previous model. It was based on the SWRCB, and we have all the information in the white paper.
Thank you. Do you want to explain what the SWRCB is real fast?
Yeah, so it's an engineering multiplier. So it's basically adjusting the cost depending on the engineering multiplier. The whole procedure or the methodology of how we came up to those numbers is detailed in details in the white paper. But I can share with you more information on a side talk, but honestly, I can't recall the exact equation that concluded. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Moj. Okay.
Okay. No more questions? Should I dive in?
Go for it. Go for it.
Step number 4. So we would be evaluating the physical consolidation funding viability thresholds. So the old model developed followed funding viability thresholds for public water systems. So the old model utilized a total capital cost less than $500,000 and a cost per connection less than $60,000. These two numbers were outlined in the intended use plan from 2020-2021. So those numbers went up. So in the 2022-2023, the cost per connection increased from $60,000 to $80,000. and the capital cost increased from 500,000 to 6 million. So in consultation with our Division of Financial Assistance, they recommended inflating the viability, the funding thresholds that appeared in the IUP by 20% to account for any inherited limitations in costing out physical consolidation or modeling physical consolidation. So after applying that 20% adjustments, the cost per connection would be 96,000. And the total capital cost is 7.2 million. For state smalls and domestic wells, for state smalls, actually, our recommended model recommends a maximum of 2 million as a capital cost. And for domestic well, we have a maximum of 150,000. I really want to emphasize that the funding viability for state smalls and domestic wells are not included in the intended use plan or the fund expenditure plan. They were developed based on consultation with our Division of Financial Assistance, based on observing physical consolidation projects in the states. The funding viability threshold that you see here on the table are for the cost model purposes only. So they're not going to be used for any funding decisions, and any funding decision will be based on project level costs, case by case, addressing clusters of households. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Moj. Wanted to see if anyone had questions around these funding viability thresholds. I see Eric has his hand raised. I'm going to unmute you, Eric. Go ahead.
Thanks, Kristen. And sorry, this is John Erickson with Community Water Center. I'm using Eric Orellana's link though, so I think I'm posing his hand. But I have just a question on the domestic well cost threshold. I think we see with domestic wells, you know, I guess anything less than 5 connections probably gets lumped in as a domestic well. So you could have like a few households on a property sharing a domestic well, or even a few properties sharing one domestic well. So that might be like kind of the equivalent of 4 connections using one domestic well. And I'm curious whether when you applied this cost threshold, whether that's like 150,000 per household served by a domestic well, or 150,000 per actual well. Because it seems like if it's just per well, it might be a little low if maybe you've got 3 or 4 households really served by that well, and that's the equivalent of like 3 or 4 connections.
It's a great question. I wish we could get more granular in how we look at the domestic well data. Unfortunately, our domestic well data is super limited. We only have the general location of these wells within a 1 mile by 1 mile square radius. We don't have up-to-date information on how many connections the well serves for our statewide data set. So we can't get more granular than, you know, 1 well. And so, you know, to generalize and to be able to include them in the analysis, we kind of have to have these more high-level assumptions. We don't get any more granular than assuming 1 well. We kind of look at it as like 1 connection, 1 pipeline, whether or not you then split that up. That's why we include some additional like bump ups in these thresholds to account for that variability. But it's a good point. You know, people need to be aware that there are wells that serve multiple households, and that in reality, these things are much more complicated than what you're going to see here in the model.
Okay, no, thanks a lot. And yeah, definitely understand that. And I think we can maybe look at more of the details and think, I'm just wondering whether it might make sense to up that 150 to something a little higher to make sure that too many domestic wells aren't left out of the analysis, but
well, you'll see in just a little bit that it doesn't make too big of a difference. And if you take a look at Appendix C in the white paper, you'll see that we experimented with different funding viability thresholds. We did 100,000, 150,000, and 200,000. And you'll see that the numbers don't change that much with those different thresholds.
Okay, oh, thanks so much. That makes sense.
Take a look. wanted to be a lot more thorough and transparent about the different options that we explored and how we got to these recommendations. So hopefully the data analysis that's detailed in the appendices help you understand kind of our reasoning and how we got here. Okay, I don't see any other hands. Let's keep going.
So applying the funding viability thresholds that I shared with you earlier, and also comparing it against the capital costs for each physical consolidation project, we came up to the counts of systems that would meet the funding viability thresholds. So the table that you see here shows the estimated physical consolidation costs broken down by system types, and it kind of compares between the old and the recommended criteria. So in general, our updated cost model kind of estimates a higher counts of failing and at-risk public water systems meeting the funding viability threshold. So we have 169 failing public water system, 248 at-risk public water systems. So the cost associated using the updated cost assumptions is of course higher because we have higher counts of systems, and also we're including like more at-risk public water systems and failing systems. So for failing public water systems, we have 550 million compared to 407 million utilizing the old model systems. For at-risk, we have 900 million compared to 727 million for at-risk utilizing the old model. State small counts and the domestic well counts and costs were lower, utilizing our recommended updates. And I keep saying this, but this is because of the inventory change. So for state smalls, we have 118 state smalls that meet the distance criteria and the funding viability threshold, which was a maximum of 2 million. And utilizing the old model, we have 231 state smalls. So our cost came to 78 compared to 103 million. For domestic wells, we have 520 million for 25,480 compared to 722 million for 35,040 domestic wells. So in total, our updated cost estimates and criteria includes 26,015 systems that would meet the funding viability thresholds and the distance criteria, with a preliminary cost estimate of 2,048 million, comparing it to the old criteria where we have 35,595 systems with 1,959 million. It's like important to like mention and kind of emphasize that in the old 2021 cost estimate report, we have a maximum physical consolidation cost in there of 1,256 million, and that cost was for 26,044 systems. Those systems were a mix of public water systems, state smalls, and domestic wells. So we definitely have not only higher cost, but we also have the cost assumptions are more inclusive to more systems. So we have higher cost assumptions and also more inclusive to more systems. It's important to also emphasize that those are preliminary cost estimates, and the full statewide cost assumptions and the full cost run will be published in 2024, hopefully.
Thanks, Moj. Before I move on, did anyone have questions around the numbers or what we have on the screen here? Again, all preliminary. Once we finalize our methodology and cost assumptions this year, we'll come out with the final results and numbers next year. So this is all very preliminary play numbers, if you will, just so we could illustrate how the criteria impacts the final numbers, and so you guys can hopefully provide some meaningful feedback based on this analysis. I think what's we all anticipated that the total cost estimate would definitely be going up because we were including some additional costs that were excluded in the old model. We knew that we needed to inflate numbers to reflect current prices and inflation. So it's been interesting to see the number, nearly double for around the same number of systems. Although we'll emphasize that our analysis definitely identifies more failing and at-risk public water systems for consolidation compared to the old model. All right, I don't see any hands raised or questions. So Moj, step 5.
Yes, so finally, step number 5. So for the systems that would meet the funding viability threshold, so basically those are the systems where physical consolidation is viable, then we would move to step 5. In step 5, we start to add any additional infrastructure or admin needs to increase the sustainability of the systems. So in our recommended model, we are proposing to add treatment costs for failing systems that are receiving, for example, systems that are failing, for example, to water quality. And in that way, we would be looking at a failing analyte, and then we would be costing out the best available technique, both capital and O&M costs to remediate the issue. Our updated model also proposes to add a cost for additional source. If the receiving system has a single source of water supply, the additional source can be another well, if the sole source was a well, or it can be an airtight. So depending on the current sole source that the receiving system has. Both old model and the recommended model includes and recommends adding other essential infrastructure. However, the old model included the OEI, that how we abbreviate other essential infrastructure, based on a statewide percentage and assumptions, while our recommended update proposes to include other essential infrastructure based on system needs, so utilizing location-specific information for each system. Also, the old model included admin technical assistance that was also based on statewide percentage and estimates. Our recommended model looking forward for a more streamlined, so we're including it based on system needs, so location and specific information. Hopefully what you see here on this table will be further explored in the 2023 workshops. I think with that being said, I conclude my portion and I hand it back to Kristen, unless there is any question, technical one that I need to respond to.
Yes, I see a question from Greg. Greg, you just submitted a Q&A, but you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask it.
Sure. Just could you give a sense? I did look at the white paper where you're, both selecting the best available technology. Is that from board standards? Is that from EPA standards? And then the cost of that technology, both capital and O&M, is that from, again, board estimates or WBS models at the federal level, or some combination?
It's going to be a combination of all of the above. We're still fine-tuning that currently. That's what the next webinar workshop is going to focus on, is that mapping, if you will, within the model between identified failing criteria and analyte and technical solution.
Got
So
it.
that's coming soon.
Totally fair. Thank you.
Yeah. I wish we could cover all of it, but I think people would be a bit too overwhelmed on this webinar. All right. Any other questions or comments on steps 1 through 5? All right. So we're going to get into some of our discussion questions, trying to, again, assess what your recommendations might be. And again, if you aren't quite sure yet how you might want to answer these questions, you can always email us after this webinar, after you've had some time to think about it and perhaps read through the white paper. We're looking for general feedback in terms of, do you agree with the proposed methodology for physical consolidation in the model? We tried to be super transparent about how the model works and the steps in getting water systems through that model. And do you have any suggestions or feedback on the updates to our cost component assumptions? So those are all those cost numbers that we showed you If you take a look, I know Moj said it, I've said it, if you take a look at Appendix B, we do include very detailed explanations on how we got to those updated cost assumptions. We did look at projects that we have funded here at the State Water Board. We've contacted vendors and consulting firms, and we've also even talked to a few water systems trying to get their feedback and recommendations on what these numbers should be updated to. But if you disagree, please let us know, or if you feel like we're missing something, like Jennifer mentioning the CPUC fees, we'd love to hear from you. Not seeing any hands or questions. Okay, we can always circle back if something comes to you. There was some specific cost numbers that we were thinking about, but we didn't include in this analysis, and we wanted to see if anyone had strong feelings about this. We were wondering if our model should include an elevation difference cost adjustment. This would account for perhaps additional costs related to pumping that would obviously drive costs up a little bit, but we could potentially include this with the GIS analysis and cost this out as part of the model. Moj, did you have anything else to add on that?
So I think if we went with the elevation difference, as we internally discussed in the work group, we would be adjusting the cost by 5%. So it would be like a definite increase if we went with that direction, but we just would like to get public's feedback on whether we need to apply it or not.
I see Elisa has her hand up. Elisa, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, hello, my name is Alyssa Hasty. I'm a graduate student. I study consolidations and other drinking water things. I guess my question is sort of related to this topic, but also looking at like the distance criteria that you use. I think when you look at something like, what is it? It was a 3-mile distance threshold for public water systems. And just to clarify, that includes sort of like the route. When you say like the route distance, that includes that it may not be like an exact straight line between these two systems. Is that correct?
That is correct. We have Will on the call right now who conducted the GIS analysis. Will, do you want to just briefly talk about how we do the route analysis?
Yeah. Am I coming through clear?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, got you. Yeah, I use an ArcGIS tool known as the Network Analysis tool, and along with the North American Premium Street Maps layer in order to route along like street distance. So the 3 miles is the total distance between 2 points along a road system.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I was wondering, and I'm sure this is in the white paper as well, but if I could ask for a little bit more clarity as to where those distance thresholds come from, because on my first look, those seem like pretty short distance thresholds, and especially when you're following street routes, that becomes like you're looking at things that are very, very close together, which kind of excludes a lot of these more rural communities as well. I'm sure this is in the white paper, but I would appreciate a little bit more clarity, or at least the process of where those came from.
No, it's a great question. You know, we originally in the old model came up with the distance criteria, again, based on observations of consolidation projects that the State Water Board has been involved in, and wanted to make sure that we were conservative in the model and more realistic, because as you start adding pipeline length, the total cost of the consolidation project just skyrockets. And so, we wanted to make sure that we were realistic in the distance criteria, because anything longer would just exceed the funding viability thresholds. And so that's how we got to the 3 mile and 1/4 mile, or 0.25 for state smalls. I know we've got don't mean to put him on the spot, Chad Fisher, with our engagement units who helps work on consolidation projects. Chad, did you want to speak to anything on the distance criteria, or did I cover it? I don't know if we have him as a panelist, actually. We don't. Let me see if I can add Chad real fast. I think we have time. Here we go. Chad, I've unmuted you if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Since you can't, I think Kristen explained it pretty well. So I don't really have anything to add, but thanks for unmuting me.
Okay. Cool. Alyssa, did you have any other question or comments? Did we address everything?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Awesome. And then Greg, I'm gonna unmute you. There you go.
Yeah, just on the elevation point, I guess, looking at the white paper, if you think the 5% when it's 50 feet or more difference is credible, I'm not quite sure where that's coming from, but I'm sure it's coming from somewhere. And it sounds like it can be done in GIS without too much additional labor. I don't see why not, why one wouldn't add it, but I don't know that the 5% with the 50-foot buffer is the right one. So it'd be good to get some more documentation on that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where we had landed. We had internal work group discussions around, it could possibly be needed, and how would we include that in the model? So wanted to see if folks had any ideas before we kind of went further down that rabbit hole.
Sounds good.
Okay. Trying to see if we have any other questions. I think I saw an email actually come through. Let's see, got a question. Someone's asking for more context of why investor-owned utility systems are not included in the assessment. Are mutual water companies included? So I'm not quite sure where that came from, but investor-owned utilities and mutuals are included in our analysis. It just depends on their safer status. So they could be potentially a receiving system in our analysis and would have water systems joining them within the hypothetical model. So they are included. What's not included at the moment is consideration of CPUC fees in the cost estimate if one of the projects includes a CPUC regulated system. So hopefully that answers that question that we got in through email. Okay. I don't see any other questions or hands raised, but if folks have some, you can chime in. We're not quite finished yet. Wanted to make sure that we shared with you how you can provide feedback to us after today's webinar. We are looking for your feedback by August 14th, which is about 30 days from now. You can email us at our safer@waterboards.ca.gov email address. And again, our white paper is posted online. We encourage you to take a look at it. We'll make sure that these slides are posted soon, but you'll get a copy of them today via email. And then I wanted to emphasize again that we are going to be hosting more workshops as we move forward with our cost model rebuild. The next one, which hopefully will be later this summer, early fall, will focus on all of our proposed updates to how we model treatment for our failing water systems that have water quality issues. So stay tuned. I know Greg had asked that question earlier. We are looking to update a lot of the treatment cost assumptions that were included in the previous model. We are spending quite a bit of time to update how our O&M cost estimates are done. So for those, again, not familiar with the model, we cost out both capital costs, so the upfront costs for implementing a long-term solution. We also estimate 20-year O&M costs, operation and maintenance costs. That's really important for us to understand because obviously O&M costs tend to be borne by the community. through rates. But we want to know what those costs are because our fund expenditure plan, our Safer Dollars, does have some funding eligibility for O&M costs. So we want to make sure that we have an estimate there. So stay tuned. And if you like to get wonky on treatment cost numbers, please get involved and let us know what your thoughts are when we publish our next white paper. And with that, we are saying thank you. Wanted to just stay on for a few more minutes to see if anyone has any additional comments, questions, ideas for us to consider as we move forward. Appreciate, John, your nice comments. Susan's asking if we're kind of rethinking how we look at POU, POE in the model. And Susan, yes, we are looking at kind of rethinking how POU, POE is used in the model. So we'll be going over that in the next webinar and in the next white paper that we publish. If anyone has comments or questions or ideas for the treatment side, I know we're not covering it today and we are currently working on it. It's never too soon to give us feedback or comments. We welcome any suggestions you have as we move forward with this. Appreciate everyone's nice comments. Good job, Moj and Will on our team. And we want to thank our internal work group, which is composed of lots of really great Division of Drinking Water engineers, field staff, our Division of Financial Assistance staff. A lot of folks we meet nearly almost every week or every 2 weeks to kind of go over our different recommendations and ideas and to get feedback. So a lot of folks working on this. Okay. I don't see any hands raised. Yes, Susan, I saw your comment in here about, water suppliers being involved in our conversations around treatment and getting more CalMutuals to participate. We'd love any help anyone can get. Anyone can provide help on getting more people involved in this work. We'd appreciate it. It's hard to get folks into the nitty-gritty cost model assumptions, but if you can help share our webinar links and papers to other folks to get recommendations, we'd appreciate it. We do reach out to water systems to get cost estimates from them, if they have O&M costs that they can share with us for certain treatment technologies, or if they've procured something recently and can give us some updated capital cost information. We've tried to collect some of that. If you know water systems who have information that they can share with us, that would be awesome. All righty.